welcome to the Historic New Orleans Collection. My name is Erin Greenwald. I'm a curator and historian here at the collection, and I am very pleased to welcome you guys to this program in celebration of 25 years of the Midlo Center. We are proud to partner with the Midlo Center not only in this, but in many things, most recently in developing some of the content for the exhibition Purchased Lives, which is currently traveling around the United States thanks to a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's through collaborations with the community and with community members that we remain a vibrant and relevant institution. So we're happy to be involved in tonight's program. We'd like to thank the Midlo Center for thinking of us, the Georgetown University New Orleans chapter, the Alumni Association New Orleans chapter for helping to support this event, and also to, of course, thank the University of New Orleans. We hope to see all of you more and more at events like this as the Historic New Orleans Collection grows. In 2018, we will be pleased to open a brand new exhibition gallery space on Royal Street at the Seigneurie Brûlatour building, just across from our current exhibition galleries at 533 Royal. We're going to triple our programming space, so we'll have plenty of opportunities for future events like this. I also want to thank everyone for continuing the conversation that's been happening in New Orleans about our city's role in the domestic slave trade. I think this is a topic that has kind of flown under the radar until fairly recently, and it is very productive for us to be having these conversations. So we are thrilled to be taking part in this evening's program. I would like to take this opportunity to ask everyone to please silence your cell phones at this time. And then I'm going to turn the program over to Mary Nile Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is the co-director of the Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies, and she's largely responsible for putting this program together. So thank you, Molly.
Good evening. Good evening. Sold South, Tracing an Enslaved Community from Maryland to Louisiana is a special event marking the 25th anniversary of the Ethel and Herman L. Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies at the University of New Orleans. This evening could not have been possible without the generosity and support of the Historic New Orleans Collection, so right back at you, Erin. Especially Priscilla and John Lawrence, who graciously agreed to host this event. Special thanks as well to Erin Greenwald, Teresa Devlin, Lisa Griffin, and the rest of the staff at the collection for their patience and expertise. We are grateful as well to our other sponsors. Erin has mentioned them already, but I'm going to mention them again. It's very important. The New Orleans chapter of the Georgetown Alumni Association, which has several members in attendance tonight, and the University of New Orleans, with special thanks to our dean, Kim Long. Thanks as well to Diego, I'm going to mess up your last name, Castellanos, our videographer, Jamie Doyle, the sound technician, and Travis Wagaspak, the film editor, all of them current or former UNO students. Also, thanks to our friend Roseanne Adderley from Tulane University for her assistance this evening. And finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Connie Atkinson, my co-director, who has been the one constant of the Midlo Center for its 25-year history. Her dedication to the center and its mission is the real reason for its continued success. Connie, would you stand up so we can applaud you, please? So I'd like to just take a few minutes to explain the origins of this event. News of the sale of 272 enslaved people by the Jesuit leaders of Georgetown University in 1838, and the recent responses to this history by the university and the descendants of the displaced community have garnered important press coverage from the Washington Post, the New York Times, as well as the New Orleans Advocate and the Times-Picayune. In fact, many of those sold in 1838 ended up in Louisiana, and many of their descendants remain here. This event, therefore, is meant to highlight Louisiana's role in the larger story. It's an opportunity for people in Louisiana to discuss the significance of this history and what it means for our community. It's a chance to reflect on the historical memory of slavery and its place within family histories of Louisiana's residents. And being a welcoming sort of people, we are letting outsiders in via live stream. So, before we start our discussion, we must hear from a person who is largely responsible for what we know about the people who were enslaved in Louisiana in the 18th and 19th centuries, historian Gwendolyn Midlo. She also happens to be the daughter of Ethel and Herman Midlo, whose generosity made Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies a reality. Dr. Midlo Hall, interviewed by her son Haywood, will tell us a bit about her parents and about the founding of the center with the help of the late Joseph Logston at UNO. And she will share with us what inspired her to create the first database of historical records of enslaved people in Louisiana. The first such database, in fact, to retrieve the names, ethnicities, and stories of Africans and African Americans enslaved in North America. She was, you might say, an early adopter of digital technology and quickly recognized its importance to the field of history. If you visited the Whitney Plantation Museum, you will have seen her work already. The memorial wall at the LA Gwendolyn Midlo Hall holds thousands of names of enslaved people taken from her Louisiana database. Dr. Hall is one of the first historians of slavery to enter the archives with the conviction that individual Black lives mattered and that their personal histories could and should be retrieved. It's a fascinating story and one that could not be more relevant to our discussion tonight. So first, a bit of housekeeping before we watch that interview. You'll notice that you have a note card on your seat, or maybe you're sitting on it. But we ask that if you have a question for the panel, please write it down clearly at any point in the discussion and pass it to the far end of the room, whichever wall you're closest to. There will be people moving along the edges collecting these throughout the discussion. Also, you'll note that on the back of the program on your seat, we've put links to sources for further research, including the Georgetown Slavery Archive, a repository of relevant primary documents, the Georgetown Memory Project, spearheaded by Richard Cheryllyn, which has funded teams of genealogists looking for descendants of the original sale. Thus far, the Memory Project has found some 212 of the 272 people sold and traced some 3,300 descendants. I believe that we have a number of descendants in the room. Would you stand if you know that you are a descendant so we can see how many people we do have? Thank you. We've also included the link to Gwen Hall's database on there as well, where you can explore for yourself some of the historical documents that she scanned in from the archives containing the stories of enslaved people. Finally, if you know you're a descendant and would like to participate in an oral history project, there is one that's getting off the ground. And if you'd like to tell your family's story, the Historic New Orleans Collection is organizing an effort to collect those stories. So please contact the collection if you're interested in participating in that. After watching the interview, the panelists will get seated and introduce themselves. And then before that discussion begins, Professor Adam Rothman of Georgetown University will just give us a brief summary of what is known about the sale at this point. But first, we're going to watch an interview with Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. Thank you.
Ready? I'm Haywood Hall. I'm the grandson of Ethel and Herman Midlo. And I'm Haywood Hall. I'm the grandson of Ethel and Herman Midlo. And I'm here interviewing my mom, who's the daughter of Ethel and Herman Midlo. And well, she'll tell you who she is. I'm sure you know. And so there's some questions that I'm going to ask for this interview, but why don't we start with why don't you introduce yourself and the camera's over there.
Okay, well, my name is Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, and I took the initiative in setting up the Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies 25 years ago. And I'm very proud to be interviewed by my son, Dr. Haywood Hall, who is one of the leading international emergency medicine physicians and has done a great deal of work in improving emergency medical care in Mexico.
That's my mom. I guess, I want to start with just, how you grew up and what what happened in New Orleans and the context and what it is,
Okay.
the family and all of that. And also, obviously where Grandpa came out of. And
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, it's a long story, which I will try to make short. My father was born in Sosnowiec, which is now part of Poland. It was Upper Silesia. And he came from a Jewish family, but they were culturally Jewish, but not much believers. And once they got to New Orleans, they opened a tailor shop on South Rampart Street. And that was the business district for the black community. People have no idea how terrible the racism was in those days, and it astonishes me that people really have no idea how bad it was. And this included not just how black people were treated and brutalized and murdered and tortured and just endless, but white people had to conform to racism, or they would either be driven out, or they couldn't get a job, or they couldn't get housing, or there was tremendous pressure on white people to conform to this racism. Now, the Jewish tailors on South Rampart Street were a little bit better off than some people because they didn't depend on the white community for their income, because almost all their customers were black men who had very high-priced taste in clothes, and they were delighted to be able to get good quality clothing made for them. Okay, so when my father started practicing law, it was about 1930, which was the depths of the Depression. And he could rarely find any clients who could pay him. But that didn't bother him at all. He took people, he would take clients who he felt needed help and were deserving, and never charged them anything. And my mother would get furious because she didn't want him to work for nothing, But what my father did was that he took on a lot of cases that no other lawyer in the state would take, because it was too dangerous for them to take these cases. So in the whole state of Louisiana then, I guess all the way through the mid-40s, there were 3 African American lawyers in the whole state of Louisiana. And they were hesitant to take any touchy cases either, like police brutality, for example. I think my father was the only one who would take a police brutality case. He also took labor organizing cases, and that's what he did mainly, was early stage labor organizing. So I was raised pretty much by my father, who told me all about these cases and instilled in me the idea that I should oppose repression, oppose racism, and stick my neck out, take a chance. Okay.
Did you have an interest in history at that point?
Yes, I took 2 majors in history,
Okay.
European and something, American both, yeah. The problem was that American history at that time was absolutely ridiculous. For one thing, I was interested in slavery, and the great authority on slavery was U.B. Phillips, whose basic ideology was that Africans were so lucky to be brought to the Americas so they could learn something. And that's what they taught, you know. And they also taught something called the consensus theory of history. I bet you never heard of that.
No.
That theory was that we had never had any conflict in American history. No conflict whatsoever. Everybody's always gotten along fine.
Until?
No, there was no
period.
until.
End of story.
There was no until, okay?
In other words, shut up.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just couldn't go along at all with any of that.
One of the kind of topics that's of interest is how this is connected to your work ultimately. And, you know, I mean, you've made great strides and pioneered in the area of slavery and digital humanities and all of those things. And in many ways, you're obviously one of the inspirations for the Midlo Center itself. So if you could talk a little bit about
Okay, the work. All right. Now, again, I have to get back to my father because he introduced me to documents in courthouses when I was about 15. He hired me to work in his office, and he had me doing title searches. In other words, you go into the courthouse and you see who bought what from whom and if it was paid for and if to make sure there was no mortgages outstanding and that kind of thing. And so he took me to some courthouses, and I was looking around and I saw all these documents written in French. And so I was thinking, gee, that's interesting. Why are all these documents written in French and what do they mean? So I didn't know, but then after I learned French, then I was able to read those documents. And when my father was dying, and I came down to visit him, and then I would go to the courthouses and look at the documents, which by then I could read in French and Spanish. And they looked quite fascinating to me. And I seemed to have a lot of things there that nobody knew about. So finally, I decided that I would study slavery in colonial Louisiana. Now, the place that I went which really aroused my curiosity was I knew that there had been a slave conspiracy in Point Coupé Parish in 1795. When they called slaves up to testify, they were asking them what was their nation. And a lot of them identified their African ethnicity. So I went to see the original document. That was back in 1984. And I found this testimony and I thought, well, maybe there might be other documents that also identify the origins of these Africans. And I started to look, and I found documents that went back to 1771. And they were just not just full of information about the African origins of the slaves, but a whole lot of other things about the slaves. And at that time, nobody had any idea that such enlightening documents could exist. You know, like in those days, people thought, oh, we can't know anything about the past of slaves because they were slaves, and we have no information about them. And it turned out that was the opposite of the truth. It's just that nobody had looked. There's more information about slaves than about free people because the slaves were property. And so they needed to identify the property. And it was astounding how much information there was. And so at that point, we used to use these little index cards to take down information. But this stuff was so dense and complex that I decided this just won't work. So actually I created the first original digital database in history.
In history?
Yeah.
Okay.
And maybe in other things too, I don't know. But anyway, it was quite advanced. Now, I didn't realize I was doing anything important because to me it was just a tool for my own research. And I thought that maybe some other scholars might want to look at it, you know, or use it or something. It never occurred to me that anybody else would be interested. So I used that database for the book I published called Africans in Colonial Louisiana. When I saw all of the names, I decided this is really important. We really have to mark, you know, collect all of the names that we see on these documents. And a number of guys said, what do you want to do that for? We're just interested in statistics. I said, well, you may be interested only in statistics, and I'm interested in statistics too, but I'm also interested in human beings and what they were like, including what their names were and how they were related to each other. And so and they said, that'll slow you down. I said, well, it'll just have to slow me down.
So when you were looking up all this material, you were also taking digital pictures of documents and all of that. And what kind of resistance or difficulty did you have going into these parish courthouses and taking pictures of, I mean, it seems like that's not necessarily an easy thing to do.
Okay, well, in the courthouses, most of the clerks of court had no idea what they had. One of the places I went, the first courthouse I went to said, oh, we didn't have slaves. And of course, he really believed it, you know. He went to get a census to prove to me that they didn't have slaves, and he brought it back. It was a census of 1745. And we looked at it together, and there were more slaves than non-slaves in the parish. My mother, when she started getting older and preparing for her own death and her estate and stuff, she told me, look, your father did so much for the community, and nobody ever acknowledged what he did. And nobody ever talks about him, and his name is forgotten. And I want to do something to preserve his name in the community. And I have money set aside to do that. So and she says, you are the only one I can depend upon to do this. And I started asking around about how to do this. And Joseph Logsdon was still alive then in that UNO. And he suggested that we set up an endowed chair in his name at UNO. So I played the major role in family diplomacy. My nephew, Larry Lehman, was very much in favor of our doing this too. And so he also played a major role.
So this event that's at the Midlo Center is going to be...
It's celebrating 25 years since it was established.
Time flies.
Good evening. 25 years of former Midlo Center. And I worked with Gwen Midlo Hall for a long time. I met her mother several times. I knew about her father and the work that he was doing. But before we had the Midlo Center come into existence in 1991, the genesis of it already was taking place through the efforts of Joseph Logston. Joseph Logston, who was my teacher, mentor, friend, collaborator in civil rights and other things, was involved in setting up the Midlo Center. And I remember we talked about whether or not it ought to be a center for studies or a center for history. And he suggested that we ought to call it studies because that would be broad and we would not get into turf fights with somebody when we did something on sports, on music, on history, on politics, civil rights. And so Joe had the knack of making difficult tasks seem easy. Now, well, I don't know if you remember in 1991, the state was in a very bad financial state. We had depended for a long time on oil for revenue, and the price of oil had plummeted from a high of $40 a barrel to $7. So that certainly did not seem to be a good time to begin a new center. But typically, Joe insists that we needed to do something with rich resources that we have in New Orleans. I was one of his students at the University of New Orleans and also at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I am Raphael Cassimere, Jr., Emeritus Professor of History here at the University of New Orleans, and I will be moderating this panel along with the three panelists that you see here, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves before we go forward.
First, I'd like to say thank you to the University of New Orleans and the Midlo Center and also the Historic New Orleans Collection for hosting this conversation. My name is Sandra Green Thomas. For the purposes of this evening, I think the most important thing you need to know about me is I'm a descendant. I'm a descendant of William Harris and Betsy Ware Harris from Maryland, but who were sold to Maryland, Louisiana.
Good evening, everyone, and I would like to thank also the Midlo Center, UNO, and the Historical Collection, and Georgetown University. My name is Cheryllyn Branche. I am also a descendant. My ancestors were Hillary and Henny Ford and their infant son Basil Ford, along with 4 of the siblings of Basil, who were sold in 1838 from Georgetown and sold to a plantation called Chatham in Louisiana in the Ascension Parish, Donaldsonville.
Hi, my name is Adam Rothman. I'm a professor of history at Georgetown University, and like my fellow panelists, I'd like to thank the Historic New Orleans Collection, the Midlo Center, the New Orleans chapter of Georgetown alumni. I'd like to thank the Descendants who are here, and I'd like to send a special welcome to the several members of the audience who are brave enough to take my classes at Georgetown. Thanks for coming.
Joe Logston would be extremely pleased tonight, as I am, because I just found out that the 2 descendants are people that we knew. Miss Branche's mother and her aunt worked very closely with Joe and I in the NAACP. And Miss Thomas's father-in-law and husband also were actively involved in the NAACP. So again, you find that these concentric circles involve people who are doing things. Before we go into questions, I'm going to ask Professor Rothman to give us a brief overview of his involvement in this very, very important project. Professor Rothman.
Thanks, Professor Cassimere. My task today is really to set the historical stage for the conversation that we're going to have. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the history of the 1838 sale of the Maryland Jesuit slave community to Louisiana. But for those of you who are not, or for those of you who would like a refresher, this is the purpose of my brief remarks. And I do want to just preface it by saying one of the other reasons it's such an honor for me to be here on this stage is because of Professor Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. She was really helpful to me when I was writing my dissertation on the expansion of slavery in the Deep South in the early 19th century. And I think what the work that we're doing on this history and tracing the family histories of those who were sold is really following in her pioneering footsteps of tracing individuals in the archives of slavery, breaking down the aggregates, the generalizations, and the statistics, and really trying to put a human face on this history. I'm going to be really talking about the history of what I call the Maryland Jesuit slave community, which is, their history is a microcosm of the whole history of American slavery and emancipation and its legacies. It's a big history to wrap your head around, and I think looking at one community and the families that composed it is a way of really grasping the reality of that history. So I'll just try to summarize it in a very, very few minutes, that sense that this community is a microcosm of the whole history of American slavery. And their history really begins when the first Jesuits arrived in the colony of Maryland in the 1630s, part of the global Jesuit Catholic mission. The Jesuits were very self-reliant. Wherever they went, they had to rely on their own resources. And what that meant in the colony of Maryland was that they became tobacco planters. And the Jesuits participated in the broad transition from the use of European indentured and tenant labor in the 17th century to the use of African and African-descended enslaved people in the 18th century. So by the middle of the 1700s, the Maryland province of the Society of Jesus owns thousands of acres of land across the colony of Maryland, several farms and plantations, and almost 200 slaves. They had become one of the biggest slave owners in the colony. Maryland was really founded as a Catholic haven, a place where English Catholics could enjoy a freedom of religion. When Maryland gains its independence with the other British mainland colonies, the Jesuits and the Catholics in Maryland sort of claim their place in the mosaic of American religions by founding Georgetown College, which was supposed to educate future generations of Catholics in this American republic. So it's really a paragon of Catholic liberty. But Georgetown College was part of a Jesuit and Catholic enterprise that was deeply rooted in the economy of slavery. The idea was that the Jesuit plantations and the labor of their slaves would help pay for the education of white Catholics at schools like Georgetown. And so here we have a very concrete example of the paradox, or the reality, that in the United States, freedom for some depended on the enslavement of others. By the early 19th century, though, the whole plan was going awry. The Jesuit plantations were not profitable. They were not making money to sustain the Jesuit operations. At the same time, people are beginning to have deeper and deeper qualms about the morality of slavery, and members of the Maryland Jesuit slave community themselves were taking to the courts to petition for their own freedom. And some of the families actually did make their way to freedom through the courts. It's a really stirring story of the aspirations for freedom among that community. So beginning after the War of 1812, and 1815, 1816, and thereafter, for almost 20 years, the Jesuit and Catholic leadership in Maryland, including the leadership of Georgetown College, debated what to do about their human property. And there were a number of ideas the Jesuits batted around. They actually considered emancipating their slaves gradually over a term of years and converting their enslaved people into free and tenant farmers. One Jesuit even recommended freeing the slaves and sending them to Liberia, where they could have their own country. But in the end, the Jesuit leadership, including people who had been the president of Georgetown College, made a fateful decision to sell virtually the entire slave community to purchasers in Louisiana. They were really killing two birds with one stone by doing this. On the one hand, they were ridding themselves of the burden of slaveholding, the moral, material, and managerial burden of that. And on the other hand, they were going to raise money through the sale to help pay off the debts of institutions like Georgetown College. So in 1838, Fathers Thomas Mulledy and William McSherry orchestrated the sale of almost 300 men, women, and children to two purchasers in Louisiana. Henry Johnson, who had been the governor of the state, who owned the plantation, Chatham Plantation in Ascension Parish, and Jesse Beatty, a planter in Iberville Parish, who owned the West Oak Plantation. So they sold them. They sold them for $115,000, which is about $3 million in today's money. The slave community on several different plantations in southern Maryland was parceled out and shipped in a number of different vessels along the coastal route to Louisiana. They passed through New Orleans and were sent upriver to those plantations. And that was in 1838. And for the most part, we knew this history at Georgetown University for some time. Historians had written about it in the late 20th century, some of my predecessors. But the unfortunate thing about the historical work that had been done is nobody really asked, what happened to those people? What happened to the community that was sold in 1838? The question was just never asked. So when President DeGioia at Georgetown about 16 months ago organized the working group to study Georgetown's history of slavery and reflect on our own attempt to come to terms with that history, one of the things that came out of that inquiry was to answer that question: what happened to them? And with the help of Richard Cellini and the Georgetown Memory Project, who did yeoman work in tracing descendants, with the help of descendants themselves, who have participated in the painstaking genealogical work of reconstructing family histories, we now know much more than we did just 16 months ago. And we can begin to answer that question: what happened to the people who were sold? I think that is really what this conversation is going to be about. So I thank you for participating in this conversation. I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Professor, did the Depression of 1837 have anything to do with the decision to sell in 1838?
It did. Actually, the Jesuit leadership had decided to sell before the Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1837 hit, the price of slaves plummeted along with other commodities, and the Jesuits actually delayed the sale until the price, in the hopes that the price would come back. So it might have happened earlier if it hadn't been for that crash.
So they probably had lost by waiting until after 1837 to sell.
Possibly.
Now you said they were beginning to have moral qualms about slaveholding at this time. Was this any different from what was happening in the other major denominations, the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Baptists began to split over this issue?
Yeah, I think somewhat similar. Most of the pressure comes from outside. There was not a strong abolitionist or anti-slavery tradition within the Catholic Church. It was really Protestant denominations, some of the more radical and egalitarian Protestant denominations, that seeded anti-slavery and abolitionism, like the Quakers.
Right.
But the Jesuits and the Catholic leadership in Maryland is aware of the rising anti-slavery movement. And although for various reasons that we could talk about, they had come up with their own moral justifications for slavery, the problem for them was that it was becoming something of a scandal in the broader community. The fact that the Jesuits and the Catholics were slaveholders sort of put them in a bad light. And I think one of the reasons why they wanted to divest themselves of slavery was to sort of restore their reputation. It wasn't that they were becoming abolitionists or even anti-slavery, that they didn't want to take the stain to their reputation to linger.
So what about the popular belief that had they not sold the slaves, the university may have been forced to close?
I think that's very plausible. The college was deeply in debt. They had they'd gone on a building spree in the 1820s and 1830s, and the debts were mounting. And there was clearly a fiscal crisis at Georgetown. Now, is it possible they would have found some other way to raise the money? Well, it's always possible. But the fact is, the reality is that the proceeds from the sale provided a kind of bridge loan to get Georgetown through a fiscal crisis. So they might have found a way to stay afloat, but the fact is that the sale did pull them out of debt.
One final question. Do we know how the slaves were transported? Were they shipped? Did they come overland?
The evidence that we have is that they went through the coastal trade. We have one ship manifest for a vessel called the Katharine Jackson, with about 120 or 130 names on that manifest. And most of the names on that manifest match up with the bills of sale and the names of the Maryland Jesuit slave community. So we have the manifest for one vessel, but we're pretty sure that there were at least two other vessels that transported members of the Maryland Jesuit slave community to Louisiana. But we just haven't found those manifests yet. All the manifests, or the extant manifests, are at the National Archives in Fort Worth. And the archivists at Fort Worth have been very diligent in combing through those manifests, trying to find the ones that are missing, but we just haven't found them yet. But we keep looking.
Miss Branche, when did you first learn that your family had Maryland connections to slaves?
I was retiring in May, and it was late May. A series of phone calls came into my office, and the secretary took them. Ratchet forward, I finally called Richard Cheryllyn back after I figured out that this was not business to pass on to the next principal, that this was personal, because he was extremely persistent. And so when I called him and he told me who he was, he began going through a litany of names in my family, beginning with my name, my mother's name, Edwina Rogers, my maternal grandmother, Louise Ford Rogers, and then my great-grandfather, maternal great-grandfather, Basil Ford. And when he listed the name of Hillary and Henny Ford, I had him to start again, because that said to me that he had information about my family, as he introduced himself, that was something that needed to be followed up on, and that it was very personal at that point, because listing my grandmother wasn't a big deal in her father. They both lived in New Orleans, but Hillary and Henny as parents, which would be great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, tuned me into listening. And so he started telling me about the story, which I had no idea, and that's how I found out. Mr. Cheryllyn is responsible for getting genealogists to research this information. I knew nothing about Chatham Plantation, nothing other than a visit to Georgetown that I had made some years ago, taking students there on a college tour, but nothing other than that. So that began the journey.
So prior to this, you had no knowledge that you had ancestors who had come from Maryland?
Zero knowledge. I had assumed and compartmentalized compartmentalize that I was a daughter of slaves, but certainly not with the name Ford or with any other name that I could associate with that much lineage. So I had no idea. And as I spoke with Richard throughout the ensuing weeks and learned more and was sent more information and was introduced to Adam and other folks at Georgetown, I began to find out more.
So I assume that you shared this information with other family members that you knew and learned
Yes,
about
I did.
new
Yes.
family members?
Yes, I did, and continue to do so, especially with older family, many phone calls, emails, and some assistance from family who are technologically literate to continue to search, but also speaking with older members of the family who have information that may not necessarily be in the family database. And I can say I didn't know we had folks in Denmark and Maui, but all around the world, and recently found another DNA cousin in Jamaica.
So what is your attitude or sense of feeling about Georgetown University now?
You would ask that.
Yes.
I certainly have a mixture of emotions. I am happy to find family and to plan with family and to be able to talk with family about our origins on this side of the world. What I would like to know more about is where else we have come from, and certainly have had a DNA test done. But I think what is important for my family is the truth.
Okay. Ms. Thomas, where did your family first settle in Louisiana after they came here from Maryland?
Maryland, Louisiana.
What have you learned about them?
From this?
Yes.
Well, I learned that they came from Maryland, the state of Maryland. I always assumed that we were from Louisiana. I come from a large Catholic family, and Louisiana, as you know, is the highest concentration of Black Catholics in the nation. So I assumed that we were from here. But my story is a little bit different from Cheryllyn's. I read the New York Times, and I saw Immaculate Heart of Mary Cemetery on the cover of the New York Times. And I know that my great-grandfather, William Harris, and his brothers and brothers-in-law, including Basil Butler, that they founded that church. It was founded as St. Mary's Chapel. And they also founded a church a Catholic school for Black children with the same name. And so when I saw the cemetery, I said, oh, and I saw Mary, I said, well, what's up with Maryland? So I opened it up, I read it, and it directed me actually to Adam. And that evening, I sent an email to Adam with just a kind of vague, limited family tree. And he got back to me that very evening telling me, yes, you are a descendant. And we made arrangements to have a phone conversation, which we did. And then I was put in contact with the New York Times, and I had a series of interviews with the reporter, Rachel Swarns, and they vetted me thoroughly. And here we are today.
Have you gained any sense of pride of your slave ancestry?
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely. I have a lot of pride in my slave ancestry. I have a lot of respect for those people. They had to be not only physically strong, but very mentally strong. The constant onslaught of degradation and dehumanizing behavior and violence directed towards them. I mean, we all know that chattel slavery is practiced in this country is very unique. It never existed in Europe or in Africa. This is a unique experience that they went through, and it was the most brutal form of slavery known to mankind. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for them.
Okay, now you mentioned something which is so true, that slaves wore chattels. They could be sold, they could be leased, they could be mortgaged, they could be seized to satisfy debts. And Professor Rothman, the fact that Georgetown voluntarily sold them to pay off debt did not mean that they could not have been seized as assets to pay off debts. Have you thought much about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think partly, I think there's a kind of separation, is this on? A separation between the college and the Jesuit order itself in terms of property owning. And it's sort of a complicated set of arrangements that we're still looking into, but basically the Jesuit order was suppressed in the late 18th century by the Pope. And when that happened, a lot of the Jesuit properties went into a separate trust. A separate corporation was formed called the Corporation of Roman Catholic Clergymen. And for subsequently, a lot of the property that had been owned by the Jesuits was owned by that trust. It's not clear to me that that property could have been seized to pay off the debts of the college. They had sort of, I guess maybe it sort of insulated themselves from that. They were pretty clever in the ways they used the law to protect property. But I think that the point that these human beings were chattel is really central to this whole story. And if you look at, so not only are these people sold in 1838, but if you look closely at the bills of sale and other documentations around the sale, they're mortgaged to pay for the sale. Right. So enslaved people are not just labor, they're also capital. Right. They could be used as collateral. And we still really haven't plumbed the full depths of how important enslaved people were to the Chesapeake economy, to the Southern economy, to the whole economy of the United States on all of these different levels. And just to find a college like Georgetown so deeply rooted in a slaveholding economy is yet another reminder of all of the ways that slavery shaped the American economy and society in the 19th century. And I think that's one of the really important things about this story in terms of the overall history. It shows us that slavery shaped even institutions that most of us don't really associate with the history of slavery.
We don't know for sure, but it's possible that there were other institutions of higher education that owned slaves, because slaves could be owned by institutions, railroad companies owned slaves, some governments owned slaves. It's probably true that individual parishes, Protestant or Catholic parishes, may have owned slaves. And the one thing I always point out to my own students was that it was easy to get in slavery. It's very, very difficult to get out. I mean, you have cases of slave husbands owning their wives. What happens if you become indebted? Your wife or your child or children could be seized to satisfy those debts. It's one of those things that I think people quite often forget. We talk about individuals who, as you mentioned, were not just workers, but they constitute a peculiar kind of property. And it's always the danger that you talk about individuals. One of the most famous, of course, surgery of his Uncle Tom. His master said, "I'll never sell him. He's the best slave I have." "He's the best slave you have." "Well, that's the one I want. He's going to bring more money." And yet, as Sandra mentions, somehow the slaves managed to survive. Where did he get this spirit of survival? As bad as things are, I'm not going to commit suicide. Somehow I'm going to keep living and pass on to my descendants that there is something that is precious about life that we have to pass on to others. Did you ever wonder about your own families before you came to understand your ancestry? Why you had such strength, inner strength in your families? Either one of you.
Well, my father's family, in particular, they had certain phrases and traditions that they passed from generation to generation, but they were extremely close-knit. All you have is your family. That's what they would always say. Always stick with the brothers and sisters. Always tell your family. In fact, my family is teased for telling the same stories over and over and over again. In particular about my great-grandfather, William Harris, who was the son of Betsy and Samuel, and he had been enslaved, but he was the up from slavery story. You know, after emancipation, he and his brothers and brothers-in-law all pooled together, and if they saw a piece of property one of them wanted, they would identify it, all pitch in together, purchase it, and then gradually buy each other out of it. He was able to, achieve elective office. He was on the school board and the police jury. you know, ginned his own cotton, had his own store, all his sons-in-laws worked for him, you know, just, it was all about the family and everybody pulling one another up and remembering those traditions and always being together. And even though I didn't grow up in Maryland, every year we would have a family reunion behind 4th of July weekend, and everyone had to go back, and you had to go and see all of your elderly relatives and your distant cousins. So there was always just a strong sense of community and family, you know? And I think that's the thing that got them through, you know? That's the thing that got them through.
And I think likewise in my family, so many traditions, but I think the biggest traditions were around the faith practices. My grandfather was very Baptist, and you know in New Orleans, a bar or a church.
Every corner.
Okay, and so he lived 2 doors from the church with his name on the cornerstone, and my grandmother was Catholic, but very, very Catholic, so involved in the church. I really thought she was a saint. And like many Catholic families, you always had one that was going to be somewhere in your family, a priest or a nun. So we also had a nun. So ours was around my faith practices. But what I always marveled at as I got older was the fact that the Catholic and the Baptist traditions were hand in hand, and there was so much respect. Because you know in the Catholic Church, if you marry someone out of your faith, your children still have to be Catholic. And I marveled for years as to how my dad allowed that, because he was so involved, and my grandfather so involved, and yet both my grandmother, maternal grandmother, and my mother married Baptist men. So ours was really around the faith practice and the pride in that, and pride in just being family, as Sandra indicated with her.
You know, that's one of the myths that we have, that the biggest tragedy of slavery was the disruption of slave families, and you don't have this sense of community. And because we know that's not true. But it's also an unfortunate accompaniment to that is many blacks who grew up with a sense of embarrassment to have enslaved ancestors. In fact, I remember one of my colleagues who was African American was boasting about his proud ancestors who jumped aboard the ships rather than be slaves. So how do you get here?
Well, you know, to that point, being from New Orleans and growing up around, and I'm not disparaging the Creole community, come on, I don't want to get beat up, but they all always talk about being descended from free people of color, and that's all wonderful and beautiful. But you know, before that person was a free person of color, either they were enslaved or somebody in their family was enslaved. And you need to give props to those people that were able to come through slavery and out the other side, and to raise children who aspired to freedom, or who were lucky enough to attain their freedom.
Well, maybe they didn't know, because my grandmother used to have that contradiction. She always talked about we were free. Her father's side of the family was free. I don't know how long. But she always talked about the fact that her mother was a slave. I don't even know if she realized the contradiction that she was talking. They were proud of the fact that they were free. But she talked about the fact that her mother was a slave. In fact, her mother was sent to Missouri from New Orleans. I'm sorry, the grandmother was a slave in Missouri, and her daughter was sold down the river to New Orleans. And after slavery ended, she found her daughter. And I remember, some of you may remember Gerald Johnson, who was my professor and colleague at UNO. I said, well, how could she have come all the way from St. Louis and found her daughter? She found her, didn't she? So very proudly, she went to different neighborhoods and said, do you know Marie Webster from St. Louis? And found her. So I'm saying, yes, pride in the fact that they were free, but at the same time, recognize the fact that they did have slave ancestry. And there would be very, very few African Americans who don't have some slave ancestry somewhere. Do you think Georgetown has done enough to right this wrong? Any of you?
I'll answer that first. I'm going to preempt them by saying no. I don't think Georgetown has done enough. I think we've made a good start. But the work is really not anywhere near done, and there's a lot more to do. And I'll make one point about this, and it's So this history of Georgetown's connections to slavery and the 1838 sale was never a secret. And in fact, it's been part of Georgetown's history. One of my predecessors in the history department of Georgetown wrote a bicentennial history of the university that was published in 1989. And in that 2-volume history, he writes about Georgetown and the Jesuits' connections to slavery and slaveholding, and the fact that the 1838 sale pulled the college out of debt. In the 1990s, the American Studies program had developed a curriculum around this history. They had created a website that published some of the documents. And in fact, probably the very first person to understand her family history and genealogical connection to the Maryland Jesuit slave community was a woman named Patricia Bayonne Johnson, who almost 15 years ago had done this genealogical work using the documents that the American Studies program had posted on its website. But things change, and curriculums change, and websites disappear, and people forget. So when President DeGioia launched the working group now a year and a half ago, the vast majority of people around the Georgetown community had no idea that this had happened. They did not know the history. So one of our achievements, I think, has been to make this history known. But unless this history is still known 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or 50 years from now, then we really haven't done our jobs. So the answer, have we done enough? Well, we will not have done enough if everybody forgets again.
So thank you for that. And in my introduction of myself, I said thank you to Georgetown. And basically, it was for finally telling the truth in a way that more of us could access it. I think writing it the way it was written in the 80s or the 90s allowed maybe a very close community to be aware of Georgetown's sin and the Jesuits' sin. And now that it is more public and we are more aware, I am hopeful that the influence that Georgetown has allows more people to know the truth. And am very concerned that it did not come out sooner as the truth and as part of Georgetown's history. But now that we have it, it is up to all of us who want to really know our history, because it is a shared history, that we should know and be able to move forward in our schools and in places where history is actually taught.
And that truth is evolving, right, Cheryllyn?
Yes.
As you all do more research. I mean, the story has been, well, the way it originally broke was that Georgetown was divesting itself of slaves, but haven't you all discovered since then that after the sale, they owned slaves and they continued to purchase slaves? So they didn't exactly get out of the slavery business. So that's something that we need to recognize here. And I think that the true nature of slavery as practice in the Americas is just really coming to be commonly known. And there is some resistance to the fact that actually that is how this nation was built. I mean, you can look at the writings of someone, you're a historian, like John C. Calhoun, and didn't he say something to the effect that there has not been as of yet any wealthy or civilized nation that in one portion of the community lived off the labor of another portion of the community? That's the story of this country. And he believed in slavery. He was the philosophical proponent of slavery, And then you couple that with another statement of his, and he gave in a speech about this country is not divided based upon what rich and poor. It's divided between white and black. And the former, whether they are rich or poor, are to be treated equally and with respect. So that's what's at the foundation of this country. And until you realize the humanity of black people and what black people have been through in this nation and what we've contributed to this nation, we're still going to have the inequities that persist today. And also black people need to realize it too. We need to know our history. We need to know what an important component, an essential component. You know, you have people out here now like this Richard Spencer character talking about, you know, America became America because of the unique genius of white people. You know, and they would have figured out another way without slaves to get all this done. But think about this. Think about America, the United States of America, becoming the wealthiest and most powerful nation on the planet in under 200 years. How was that possible without the exploitation of a particular group of people? That is not possible.
In a few minutes, we can open up the floor for questions, and if you have them, write them down and pass them to either Ian. But we're going to continue the discussion, and I always would tell my students that greed kills conscience. Slavery was profitable. Slavery would not have continued if it was not profitable. And as you hinted at, in 1860, the last year before the Civil War, there were only 9 millionaires in the country. 6 of them were slaveholders. Slavery was very profitable for a few, but most people didn't own slaves. I have some figures that are really interesting. The average slave in 1850, whether of any age, sex, or condition, sold for $400. But that's about $11,000 in our money today. A prime slave who had some of his special skills, such as a blacksmith, in 1850 sold for $2,000. That's about $56,000 in our money today. So if you could afford to own a slave, you could make money. But most people didn't own slaves. A lot of people would like to have owned slaves. In fact, as time passed, fewer and fewer people owned all of the slaves. 23% of all Southerners owned all of the slaves. Take that back. 23% of all Southern families own all of the slaves. So you could have been a part of the family and didn't own any slave. I often mention to my students, you know, you're in a family, father, mother, they have 2 cars, you don't own any car. And your parent will probably remind you, this is my car. So most of the slaves were owned by a few people because that was a sizable investment. You had to feed your slaves something. You had to give them some kind of clothing. You had to provide housing for them. And there were a lot of people, because who would love to have owned a slave or two, but never did. But then there's this question about morality of slavery. You can always kind of temporize. Well, I treat my slaves well. What would happen to my slaves if I free? That always the question, well, what are we going to do with the slaves if we free them? Well, W would say, do nothing for us, with us, or by us. Just leave us alone. But there was always this question, if I free my slaves, can they take care of themselves? They're dependent upon us. In fact, there's some slaveholders who went so far to say, we are the real slaves because we're the ones who have to worry about feeding our slaves, and we're the ones who have to worry about making sure they have a place to stay. They never asked to change places. I never heard of any case where a slave would say, well, I'll change position with my slaves. So it's a very complex legal system, very complex social system. And of course, as I mentioned, once you got into it, how do you get out of it? And I suspect that some of the Georgetown slaves will bequest to the church, you know, you were not quite sure what was going to happen to you on the other side of life. Maybe if I give the church some property, this might square things for me. So the church may have inherited slaves. There were people who did in fact decide, well, we're going to free our slaves when we die. George Washington decided to free all of his slaves when he died. But he didn't own all the slaves. His wife owned more than half. And well, some slaves who had been owned by Washington were freed, and they stayed on, and the other people were not free. Well, I'm going to free you when I die. When you die, she was afraid to come out of her room. Because the slaves knew that when she died, whenever that was, they were going to be free. So she did stipulate that when she died, that her slaves would be freed, and she didn't live too much longer after George did. But I'm saying this is one of those complex questions when you're talking about human beings. But I want to bring this up. We're talking about something that happened almost 2 centuries ago. According to the United Nations, there are still between 20 and 40 million slaves in the world today. Today. Mauritania, West African country, abolished slavery 5 times, most recently 2007, and still it's estimated that 10 to 20% of its population is enslaved. What are we going to do about slaves today? Many of them are sex slaves. Many of them children were sold into slavery. There was a case a few years ago where the children in Minnesota raised $50,000 to redeem one slave boy. Well, if you pay $50,000 for a boy, it makes it very profitable for people to continue having slaves. What are we going to do about slaves today? It's true, we ought to be concerned, and I am, about how my slave ancestors were treated. But what about the people who are enslaved today? Are we going to raise our voices and try to do something for them? One final question to the panelists. What do you think should be the legacy of this discovery today? Sandra, why don't we start with you?
Oh my goodness. What should be the legacy? Well, I guess a teaching tool, a teaching tool. I mean, there's a lot of our history that's been suppressed and ignored. Here's an opportunity for us to learn the truth about this nation and about all of our roles in this nation. And also, there are lots of people who say, well, I didn't own slaves, my family didn't own slaves, what does this have to do with me? Well, if you're white and you're in this country, you benefit from white privilege. And white privilege is a vestige of slavery. So maybe you can learn the truth about your place in this country and the advantages that you've had, and maybe black people can learn about their contribution to this nation and how we were essential to its development.
So as an educator, it's always been important to me that students learn about themselves and learn about their history. And initially when I was told about this, and one of my DNA cousins by marriage, who's in the audience, saw the interview on CBS, she said, Cheryllyn, I'm a descendant also. And I said to Karen, Karen, we've got to get together because this is bigger than us. We've got to tell the story, and we've got to do something about having Georgetown to be more accountable. And I think for many of us in our descendants group, now called the GU 272, we feel that we have to establish that place that allows us to provide an opportunity for our descendants collectively to get together, to have a place to do genealogy, for Georgetown to assist us with that, and to be very forthright with all of the things that they have in their archives. Adam facilitated a visit. I actually put my hands on the sale documents of my ancestors. And I can't tell you how moving that was to see their names listed in a manifest, and to see that manifest and to actually touch it. I think for me and for any descendant and for any African American, knowing who you are and where you come from, as for anyone else knowing, having that information means a great deal. And with the influence that Jesuit institutions have, there are many high schools, there are some elementary schools, there are universities. Learning, education separates all of us. And so if the opportunity is fostered for more educational opportunities and aspirations to be fulfilled by descendants, that's a goal of mine, and that's what I think Georgetown should certainly contribute to.
Well, I can't really top those two comments, and I agree. I really agree wholeheartedly that one of the lasting legacies of this is a deeper understanding of who we are as families, as a university, as a society, and I think that's extremely important. One of the things that President DeJoy at Georgetown talks about, taking it from looking at the Jesuits and the people who orchestrated the sale, is to recognize that they had a kind of limited moral imagination. They could not think themselves out of this box of slavery. That they had alternatives to civil in the States, but they couldn't act on that moral knowledge. And it's sort of easy for us today to condemn people in the past for not living up to the ideals that we think they should have lived by. But I think the deeper challenge is to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, what are our moral blind spots? What are the limits to our own moral imaginations? It's really hard to see your own blind spots. That's what makes them blind spots. But I think paying attention to this history challenges us to do everything we can to figure out where those blind spots are, so we don't make the same kinds of mistakes that our predecessors did. So perhaps one of the legacies of this whole inquiry would be to expand our own moral imaginations.
But one of the things I would hope was that other institutions who have similar past that may not be as well known would do the same kind of discovery, confess up, make some kind of effort to right these wrongs, because again, I'm sure Georgetown was not the only institution that was involved in these kind of things. Now, again, going back to the notion that slaves were laborers as well as they were commodities, and they labor debased work, but at the same time, it also debased the work of poor whites. If you go back to the area that was once the Basin Canal, and there's a marker there listing the graves of hundreds of Irish workers who lost their lives digging canals for $1 a day. No sane slaveholder would risk his slave in this type of work. They were too valuable. So there were other people who were not legally slaves, but their human worth was devalued because of slavery. And that's something I think people don't often understand. That there is a story that needs to be told about the exploitation of human beings that often went beyond color. That those who had certainly much more than they needed in many cases, tend to exploit whoever they could exploit. And I suspect, again, that if it wasn't more, in fact, I know if it wasn't more difficult to recapture runaway whites because they looked like free people, there'd been more whites who were involved in slavery. There were white slaves in the 17th century. So I would hope, again, that this would be not the end, but the beginning of a discussion, that there would be inquiries by other institutions who may have been solid, maybe not so solid partners in slavery. And I think this is something that's certainly needed at this time in our history. Closing comments from any of the panelists before we open up for questions? Or maybe your comments will come out in questions.
Well, I just wanted to indicate that recently there were a number of universities that have admitted to the slave culture: Brown, William and Mary, Georgetown, obviously UVA, and there are others that are indicating that was part of their history.
Okay. Professor Adler.
Good evening. I wanted to thank the Midlo Center and Historic New Orleans for including me in this small task, because I have learned a lot from both Professor Hall herself. I'm in part a slavery historian because of her work. I've also learned a lot from Professor Rothman's work. I direct Africana Studies at Tulane, and my life and all of our public humanities is so much richer for partnerships with the Midlo Center and Historic New Orleans, so I'm grateful for that. I would say that to our panelists and to the audience, if your question is missed, we got 21 questions, and unless they can speed answer in about 35 seconds each. So we've done our best to kind of group them and merge some of them together. I wanted to start with, we had a couple of quick, very Georgetown-specific questions, Adam, that maybe you could just clarify. A direct question about whether Bishop John Carroll himself owned enslaved people at all, and a number of questions, if you could say a little bit, have a tonight about the scholarship program and what that initiative means in relationship to the descendants and what those initiatives, and also if maybe there are more expansive ways of thinking about it. One of the questions asked that this is a multi-generational question, so what does this mean over the long term? And the last question is, has there been any resistance or backlash, either within the university or from alumni?
Okay, first on Bishop Carroll, I don't know off the top of my head. And being a responsible historian, I don't want to say the wrong thing. So let me get back to you on that one. I have a vague recollection that Carroll did own slaves, but manumitted them, he emancipated them. But don't quote me on that. The second question was, see, I've lost the question.
About the scholarship program and initiatives and
There was a question before.
yes, well, there were a number of questions about that, and one was, if you could explain briefly what the sort of scholarship initiative was, but also, what do you think about what should be the long-term fate of that?
So I believe the scholarship initiative is referring to the special consideration given to descendants who are applying to Georgetown. Essentially, right now, in the admissions process for Georgetown, the children, the faculty, staff, and alumni get a kind of second look in the admissions process. So the admissions committee really looks closely at those applicants to make sure that it's really doing the right thing, either by admitting them or not admitting them, as the case may be. It's just a special consideration given to people who are considered to be members of the Georgetown community. That same consideration is going to be given to descendants who apply to Georgetown. It's not a huge thing at all, but it is sort of a recognition that they're part of the community and deserve the same kind of consideration. Now what happens then is, if somebody is admitted to Georgetown, Georgetown is one of maybe about 20 schools in the country that is what's called a need-blind, full need school. So applicants are admitted without any consideration for their need, and once they're accepted, Georgetown puts the full resource of its treasury to try to guarantee that Georgetown is affordable for those students. So Georgetown really pledges that nobody who's admitted to Georgetown should be denied a Georgetown education because they can't pay for it. So that same scholarship program would apply to descendants who are admitted to Georgetown as other people who are admitted to Georgetown. That's the extent of it.
Okay. And the last question was about whether there's been any resistance or backlash either within the university or from alumni.
My own experience has been generally no. The university community, students, staff, faculty, and alumni has been overwhelmingly positive about everything that we're trying to do on slavery memory and reconciliation. It's been incredibly heartening and encouraging to get the levels of support. Now, on the other hand, if you ever read the comments section of any newspaper article about this, in the New York Times or the Advocate or whatever, it will just, what's the word? It will chill your blood, because people write the most horrible things about what we're trying to do. People deny the history of slavery. They say that let bygones be bygones. They say, well, who wasn't a slave? They say all sorts of things that are really forms of denial and silencing and erasure. But those are in the anonymous comments section. And so you know it's out there. You know those opinions are out there, but I'm pretty confident that they have not in any way stopped us from trying to tell the truth about this history.
We had,
Excuse me, you don't mind if I
No,
just
please go
interrupt
ahead.
for a minute? I don't know if all of you are familiar with how actually need blind works. It isn't just a scholarship system. It does include loans. So these students, if they can surmount the hurdle of getting into Georgetown, once they get into Georgetown, they will put together a package for them, which will include loans. So it's not like they're getting an education for free. All right, thank you, that's all.
A combination of outright grants, loans, and work-study with different packages for different students.
I would say that's a particularly important intervention to honor our audience. The way the question was phrased was perhaps Georgetown might fully educate for free at least a generation. That was the question that was asked, so it is worthy of, as we think about, as Adam said, that there's one ways this initiative can expand. In the interest of time, most of our other questions were very historical-based questions, and for the whole panel, what can any of you tell us about what we know about what happened to these 272 enslaved people once they arrived in Louisiana? Is there any evidence that speaks to whether subsets of that community remained intact, having arrived here as a group, either through the enslavement in Louisiana or even after the Civil War? Because we kind of have the piece of the sale story and these descendants sort of stepping back. So what do we know about essentially all the rest of that time and how much community or connection there was?
Yes.
Right, so we know they were sold again. On both the Chatham plantation and West Oak plantation, those plantations and the people who lived there as slaves were sold multiple times between 1838 and emancipation when it came during the Civil War to Louisiana. And so that's a horrible history. It has advantages for genealogical and historical research because the documents about those subsequent sales, we have those documents, and you can see in the names continue into the 1840s and 1850s, and so you can actually track sort of the growth and change of these communities of these two plantations over time, ultimately through emancipation. One of the most remarkable sets of records that we've come across are records from the Freedmen's Bureau in 1864 and 1865 that are labor contracts between the newly freed people and their former owners on Chatham and West Oak. And the poignant thing about those documents is that those are the first documents where these people appear as free people, getting paid for their labor. But of course, the question is, in those documents, how free were they really? They were no longer slaves. And we really say, under the conditions of emancipation and Reconstruction, that they were free. And I think most people who know the history would say, no, not entirely.
A question directly for Ms. Branche and Ms. Thomas. Could you comment on how the revelation of this particular family connection to the 1838 sale from a Roman Catholic institution has affected your perception of the Roman Catholic Church, your own relationship to it? And you can speak from your own experience or from talking to other descendants, because that is a big part of the story. And as you said, this is a place where the Roman Catholic Church and our relationship with it is enormous.
So certainly I can speak from my personal experience, and as I indicated in speaking about my ancestors, my grandmother in particular and grandfather, faith was major, and I don't doubt that their faith is what kept them going and what kept them moving and what kept them pushing toward some form of equality. And although we know that they lived in the 19th century, in the 18th century, 19th century, particularly my grandmother was a very, very faithful person. And we know that the slaves were taught the Catholic religion practice. What's important is that, as I say, we compartmentalize our faith. It has nothing to do with bondage. It has nothing to do with what someone else may think, even what a priest says, beyond what you know is that inner relationship with God, with the Creator, with Jesus Christ if you're Catholic. And so for me and for my family, it has been faith that has brought us, we say thus far. My grandmother had an 8th grade education, but all 4 of her daughters went to college. That was extremely important to her. When I was a little girl, my grandmother was still teaching people to read in the neighborhood and looking at documents with them. So for her, it wasn't just about her faith, and going to church, which was 1 block away, and fulfilling all of those wonderful responsibilities and bringing communion to others and helping to raise a granddaughter who became a nun. It was about faith, not just in her family and God, but not so much, I would say, in the church, but practicing her faith as a good Christian woman, and having a Baptist husband. So I think that it's extremely important. Extremely important, and many of us who went to Catholic schools call ourselves Catholic school survivors. So, and those of you, you know yourselves, you know who you are.
Well, let's see. My family was very much involved with the church, supporting the church financially. Oh, my father could recite parts of the Mass in Latin. He was a good altar boy. My brother was an altar boy. In the 70s, when they flirted with altar girls, I was briefly an altar girl. I taught catechism, all of that good stuff. We even had a family priest who passed out the Christmas toys. I can show you the pictures of us sitting in a semicircle with him in the middle. Now, that being said, my family, that would seem to indicate this fact that my family was very much involved with the church and its representatives. I got to see them up close from the time that I was very young. Needless to say, the church is comprised of human beings, and human beings can be cruel. So, where I stand today, I am the most lapsed of lapsed Catholics after observing them up close. And as far as my ancestors go, their faith had to have been transcendent in order to have gone through what they went through and to continue to practice their Catholic faith. And I guess that's all basically I have to say about the church. But also adding this, I was not one bit surprised by the fact that members of the church owned slaves and that they did what slavers did. Not a bit surprised.
I guess as a bit of a follow-up to that question, as a part of the project, either at Georgetown or locally, have we had any active conversations with the contemporary Catholic Church? Because on this podium we have a historian from Georgetown, we have descendants, and I wondered if that is a part of this dialogue.
On the working group, there were 3 Jesuit priests, and the chair of the working group was a Jesuit. So there was Jesuit representation in a serious way in the working group. One of the dimensions of outreach from Georgetown Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation initiative is to the Catholic community in and around Washington, D.C. There's a group, I can't remember the exact name of it, but something like the Committee on Catholic Social Thought. And they took up this question earlier in the fall and had a big panel with a big crowd, a lot of black and white Catholic leaders in the DC community. I know there have been conversations with the Jesuit leadership about measures of reconciliation going forward. So that is part of this effort.
Also, Father Bob Hussey, who is head of the Maryland province of Jesuits, recently met with Pope Francis in Rome. We know that there's an encyclical from Pope Francis that suggests that the Catholic Church recognize and reconcile its history with slavery. And so we look forward to what the outcomes may be regarding what the church is going to do. And having had personal conversation with Father Bob Hussey, our descendants representatives went to Georgetown to speak with President DeGioia and his chief of staff, Dr. Ferrara, and also Father Bob Hussey and another historian. And so what we hope to have out of that conversation is what will the Jesuits do and what will Georgetown commit to?
I have a whole bunch of questions now that are very sort of back the other direction, historic questions. I think, I can't remember if one or both of you mentioned looking into DNA, but we had a question about whether, and this is really to the whole panel, about any project, any work to document the origins of the 272 individuals in Africa, in the Caribbean, and wherever else they came from before they got here, either through DNA or essentially stretching in the other direction before they arrived here and were a part of this sale.
Well, Adam, I think I heard you say that it's looking like that the families had been there for, what, 100 years before the sale. So they've got a lot more research to do, you know, a lot more research.
Yeah, one thing we would really love to be able to do is track families, you know, back to their origins, to the origins of the documentary record, to particular, you know, slave ships coming from Africa. That is really difficult to do, given the nature of the archival record. It might not be impossible, but it's really difficult. But I really understand that desire to trace the families, you know, that far back. There's at least one family that can be traced back to the 1670s and 1680s, which is pretty far back for anyone. But I'm learning about the DNA evidence and study along with everybody else, and it's just been fascinating and a revelation to me to see what you can do with DNA evidence to both track family relationships, but also ethnicities going back to Africa. And it's actually sort of the next, maybe the next generation of what Professor Midlo Hall was trying to do with her database of African ethnicities in colonial Louisiana. Sociologists and historians talk about something called natal alienation as an essential characteristic of slavery, that idea of being separated from your history and your family. I think one of the things that this project is doing is overcoming that natal alienation, helping people reconnect with their families in all sorts of ways, and maybe, in the long run, it may cross that basic genealogical barrier of the transatlantic slave trade.
So one of the things that's happened most recently for us is that we've not just had, many of us have had DNA testing, and so between 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and GED Match, is that right? GED Match, okay. Those three search engines and databases that we are better able to collect and find out folks who we may not have known, who are. This is my cousin here. That's right. That's right. We did not know. We didn't know. We didn't know. So it's helping us to put the pieces together.
I think that part of it too really honors Dr. Hall's legacy as one of the earliest pioneers in really using technology in ways that when she started it was thought unimaginable. This one I will read exactly as it was written. It seems unusual that so many people went to only 2 plantations. What do we know? Do you think there was already community that added to their strength and some of what we were able to do after their arrival? How well did descendants, and this may be most partly for Professor Rothman, how well would descendants in such a relatively large group know each other before they arrived? Because in the whole history of slavery, I think the question is phrased, 272 people is a small number, but that's a pretty large group to end up in only 2 places. And what can we know about what sort of relationships they had with one another?
It seems that the groups that were sent to Chatham and West Oak Plantation were sort of settled on plantations where there were already at least small numbers of slaves living there already. Because if you look at the subsequent bills of sale, there are names on the property records in the 1840s and 1850s, which really don't come from the Maryland Jesuit slave community. So there had to have been a sort of melding of different communities in 1838. So we're still piecing that part together. But my sense is that, quite a few of, my sense is that the Maryland Jesuit slave community, although they were scattered across 4 or 5 plantations in southern Maryland, had these interlocking kin and family networks that were, that had developed over generations and were, keenly conscious of each other. So this is a not unique, but an unusual situation where pretty much an entire community of people is uprooted and transplanted to the Deep South. That didn't happen all that often, unless it was planters who were migrating themselves to the Deep South. More often, the domestic slave trade are individuals or a family here and there who are sold and sent really in an isolated way to the Deep South. So having an entire community uprooted and transplanted like this is pretty unusual, but also having just the incredible density of documentation around it is unusual. And I fully believe that this is the best documented case of a mass sale of enslaved people in American history. And that gives tremendous opportunities for scholarship and for understanding. But that community was pretty close-knit. And imagine, here's an English-speaking community that's transplanted to a French-speaking society. There are reasons why they might stick together, and they do stick together. You can see it in the marriage patterns that continue from 1838 for decades into emancipation and into the late 19th century. They're marrying each other, and it's a close-knit community.
And I guess equally big question for the descendants. How has the knowledge of the details of your ancestors' experience and lives affected how you live your life, how you approach the act of day-to-day living?
Well, Sandra has known this longer than I have by a few months, I guess. So at this age and stage in my life, it's taken me on a journey that is just unimaginable. And my family, many very older or much older people in my family are energized by the knowledge. I had no idea, for instance, my grandmother never spoke of slavery. She only spoke of the Depression, yet her father was a slave. He was skilled labor, so he was able to get a decent job in New Orleans and buy a home after emancipation, but and I never knew what a cooper was. You know what a cooper is?
Yeah.
A cooper. So he was a cooper. That's skilled labor, and so I'm really proud of that. At the same time, I wonder if he was really paid for the length of time that he was a slave.
Not if he was a slave.
That's what I'm saying. If he had been paid for the length of time, he was brought over as an infant in arms. So the entire family was enslaved and continued to be enslaved on the plantation in Louisiana. So after the emancipation, when he got work on the same plantation as a cooper paid, then he was able to save money and come to New Orleans after, I think, 1867. 1868 is a record here in New Orleans. I'm proud of that. At the same time, there is still so much pain around the actual pain of what my ancestors had to have gone through, and to know that for generations that there was slavery, and just to think about a mother carrying a baby, an infant, and with 4 other children through this process, and what that meant to the family and what it did to the family. So very strong and resilient, but at the same time, it's painful to think about, and there are times that I'm shaking because it's just painful to know.
Well, for me, it's made my already hectic life a lot busier. I have a lot of new people in my life and a lot of additional tasks as we try to get something done to make some sense and something meaningful for the descendants and the community at large. So it's given me a lot more tasks to do. And I'm going to tell you, my great-great-grandfather was a skilled laborer too. He was a blacksmith. So he was a blacksmith, and my great-great-grandmother, Betsy, had a 5-month-old when she got on the boat too. So So we truly are cousins. Okay. All right. And so, yeah, for me, it's an opportunity. You know, it's an opportunity to think about what they went through and to ultimately have it come to some good and some meaning and some legacy. As far as I look at Georgetown, Adam, I see Georgetown as belonging to me and to my family. And that's the way I approach it. You know, I know you all don't know this, but ironically, when I was first married, my husband is a lawyer here, and he always wanted to have a practice in DC, and so I said, well, honey, let's go for it. He went up, he set up the practice, and to find us a place to live, he selected 3 houses. He said, now you fly up and pick which one you want. And when I went to DC, I saw the 3 houses, and the one I picked was 3261 O Street. Now, I don't know if you know the address of Georgetown is 37th and O. I live 5 blocks from Georgetown, and you see those little babies over there? I used to push them around in a stroller on Georgetown's campus and never knew. So I think it's just life and things coming full circle. Everything coming full circle.
Well, that is a beautiful comment that has walked us to the next question. Is there any attempt by Georgetown, or do any of you have any views on this, to incorporate the voices of these descendants in governing boards at Georgetown beyond the scope of this project? That if they are a part of Georgetown's history and family, and we're thinking about what all this means in the present, what does that mean in practice beyond the project in terms of how essentially the future of the university and how governing boards and committees are shaped?
I honestly don't know about governing boards, and I would doubt it.
That's the truth.
But in terms of the work of the Slavery Memory and Reconciliation Initiative, I think there are a lot of projects and a lot of activities that are going on that we would dearly love to have descendants involved with. I don't want to. I wouldn't wish committee work on anybody. But I think it's actually very important for Georgetown to have members of the descendant community on the committee, for instance, that is going to design a memorial for about Georgetown's history of slavery and other kinds of projects that are going around the university. I would dearly hope that descendants would be part of that process. And I think that could happen, but we will see. And here, I'm actually not speaking as a representative. This is somebody at Georgetown, a historian who's
Better not, you're being recorded.
I don't know if either of you wanted to comment.
Well, certainly when we found this information and Georgetown came out publicly and they did the working group, we requested that we be a part of what is going forward in terms of Georgetown's plans, because we certainly felt that nothing should happen for us, about us, without us. Okay, and that was a phrase read by Joe Stewart when the Declaration was read and when Jack DeGioia, president of Georgetown, came out with the report publicly. And so since that time, having the opportunity to meet, correspond respectfully, we hope to be a part of the process going forward with Georgetown so that we are speaking for ourselves to the greater community and to Georgetown in terms of what they should do going forward and what we should do together. We have offered them a collaborative effort, which we hope that they will respectfully accept.
As we head, I think, to concluding remarks, the question from more than one person was, would any of you like to draw a relationship between how a project like this on the legacy of this particular slave sale speaks to larger legacies of slavery in this country, especially in light of the rich national dialogue that's been initiated in large part by the Black Lives Matter movement. We seem to be at a particular moment, and we had, I think, 4 questions that asked what this work does for that dialogue.
I think one of the latent legacies of slavery is white privilege, which more than manifested itself during this last election season. And it's something that, again, I think we knew was there. We didn't dare admit that it was there, but it came out openly. Relates to what one historian called the Mudsill thesis, that at the bottom of the society were slaves. If you were white, no matter how poor you were, no matter how uneducated you were better than any black. And I think we thought that was gone. I mean, some of us may have thought it was gone. It was dormant, but unfortunately it came out. And that's something I think maybe this educational dialogue would help bring this to light. Because help us to have an honest conversation about this too, in this notion that there's some people who just inherently better because of their race.
Any other panelists?
I guess I'll say two things. One is that I do believe that President DeGioia's decision to launch the Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation came out of an awareness of the politics of the present moment, of Black Lives Matter, of student protests at places like the University of Missouri and other college campuses, about new scholarship on the history of slavery, like Craig Stephen Wilder's book Ebony and Ivy, about the relationship between northern universities and slavery. So I think all of that is part of the reason why Georgetown is undertaking this reflective process in the first place. And then on the other side, the consequences of slavery, memory, and reconciliation are part of a broader project at Georgetown University to use its resources and standing as a university to address the pressing issues of racist injustice in the United States today. Georgetown, under DeGioia, has launched African American Studies is now a department. We're hiring this year 4 new faculty in African American Studies in various disciplines. There's going to be a center for the study of racial justice. And the historical piece of it is part and parcel of that attempt to address the world that we live in. So it's all connected.
Like many other movements in this country, this movement at Georgetown was partially initiated by students who found out the history that they didn't know that existed at Georgetown, protested, I understand, occupied the president's office for a couple of days and had their voices heard and insisted that Georgetown be a part of the truth and not the denial that had existed to their understanding before. I think in terms of Black Lives Matter, just like any other movement, whether you remember or you know about the civil rights movement, it is only through protests and continuing to push the envelope and to push the message and to push the need to tell the truth that we are edged to make change. I mean, an oyster doesn't make a pearl unless it's irritated.
That's right.
I used to tell that to my students all the time, and I hope you understand. So somebody's got to be irritated to be heard. And so for us to have this dialogue face to face gives us and all of us an opportunity to voice and to commit to cleansing and being whole and being one. And without that dialogue, we're not going to get there. If we don't talk honestly in these conversations about slavery, injustice, white privilege, or anything else that separates and divides us, if we don't do it, who's going to do it for us?
And fortunately for us, we live at a time where we're able to communicate to millions of people quite easily through social media and other other mediums. We're far more connected. As Adam said earlier, there were times when this history was being brought up again and again and again, but it was only available to a small group of people. Black Lives Matter is dispersed all through the country, and they're able to connect with one another through social media, through the internet. So this is a unique time. We had an African-American president that would bring up, other issues that need to be discussed along the lines of race. Then we have all of these studies that are coming out and readily available about disparity in lending and blacks being herded into subprime mortgages and statistics about college, African-American college graduate earns less than a white high school graduate counterpart. Someone who's African-American makes $100,000, lives in a poor community, and someone who is white who has $30,000. So all of this stuff is known, it was known by small groups of people, but now this information is readily available to everybody. And that creates a dialogue, and that creates, I think, movement, because once you know, especially if you're on the receiving end of the fuzzy end of the lollipop, you're going to try to do something about it. These stories about police brutality is not new. But now we have cell phones, and everybody can see exactly what happened, and we're able to share it. My daughter there, she did a viral video of a Black Lives Matter incident that happened in Baton Rouge, where the police came on the private property and were dragging people away. She posted that video, and within 24 hours, it had 8 million views. So we're able to communicate with one another now in a way that we never could before. So that drives it as well.
Well, on behalf of the organizers, I would thank our audience for far too many questions, and I do apologize again. I think the 7 I left out, I believe that either Dr. Cassimere or someone from the Midlo Center will do our thank yous and leave taking.
Thank you very much. 25 years is a long time, both in a third of my life. But when you hear the word center, the Midlo Center, it may portray the wrong image of large, ongoing enterprise, when in fact it's basically 2 staff persons, and underfunded, understaffed, and think what we've done. Just think how much more we could do if we received more support. So over this season of giving, if you're not sure who you ought to give to, how much you ought to give to, we ask that you consider the Midlo Center at the University of New Orleans as part of that effort. I want to thank the panelists for enlightening me. I've learned so much more about this experience, and I hope I speak for all of you when I say that this was a worthwhile project and time well spent. I'm going to turn the program over to whoever. One of the co-directors.
I'll just say thank you again for everybody and for the panelists. Drop the mic. And for the panelists, really appreciate everyone joining in this conversation, and thank you for all the wonderful questions. It really was difficult to sift through all of them, and we got some really good ones. So please join me in thanking the panel.